Appreciate your coming to hear a bunch of aging warriors spinning tales of our experiences in Southeast Asia. As you can see from my picture, it was about 50 pounds ago that I did my small part in a complex, frustrating war that took over 58,000 American lives and left many more wounded. By now, I think you can appreciate how each of us had a very unique experience depending on what service we were in, what we did within that service, even where we lived while we were in Southeast Asia, whether it was in the primitive conditions of the central highlands of Vietnam or air-conditioned quarters in Thailand. When it came to the air war, there was a lot of different, the missions varied greatly in terms of danger, if you will. There was a whole spectrum, starting at from the most dangerous, the guys that flew against the strategic targets of Hanoi and Haiphong, the most heavily defended targets in the history of warfare up to that time. That was at one end of the spectrum. And at the other end of the spectrum were those that flew troops and cargo over to Vietnam, and passing through Vietnam airspace collected credit for a combat mission as they flew over Vietnam at 30,000 feet. As for me, I guess I'd place myself somewhere in the middle of that spectrum. I flew 200 missions well south of Hanoi and Haiphong, but also into some very dicey areas of Laos and the southern part of North Vietnam. So this afternoon, what I'd like to do is just share with you some recollections from 50 years ago, how I, as a kid from Elgin, Illinois, found myself 5 years after college getting a shot at in a country that I'd never even heard of until I went to college. I'll describe the very unique mission that I was to fly over there, as well as some of the more generic strike missions flown not only by me but by most of the fighter pilots in Southeast Asia. The most vivid memories, of course, are those of the times that things went wrong, and I had my share of those in those 200 missions, and I'll tell you about two of them that certainly could have been disastrous, but what obvious, since I'm here to tell about it, came out okay. Also, what one did in his off time depended a great deal on where he was stationed. That is, whether he was in South Vietnam or Thailand. I thought you might find it of some interest to hear what life was like living in Yuban, Thailand, and I'll give you a hint, it wasn't so bad. And finally, I'll try to paint a picture of what it was like when you finished a combat tour in Southeast Asia. Well, I guess I wanted to fly ever since I was a little kid. And when it came time after high school to pick a college, we had it narrowed down with the help and encouragement of my family to two Jesuit universities, either Marquette or St. Louis. And it was not like today where they shotgun their applications out to 20 different schools. And so I looked at both of them. Milwaukee was a little bit closer, but of the two colleges, only St. Louis offered Air Force ROTC, and I wanted to be a pilot. So I said, okay, I'll go to St. Louis, and that's what I did. And that was a good decision because it was, come on in, because it was in St. Louis where I learned to fly. As I approached graduation and commissioning as a second lieutenant and being qualified as a pilot, it was time to put down our choices of where we wanted to go for flight school. At that time, there were 9 undergraduate pilot training bases in the States that you could possibly be sent to. Most of the guys put down Williams Air Force Base as their number one choice. That was in Phoenix. Not me. I put down Craig Air Force Base in Selma, Alabama. Typically the last choice of the 9. And I'm sure that little personnel clerk down in San Antonio probably broke his wrist getting out his approval stamp saying, this guy wants to go to Selma. Truth be known, I had a college sweetheart that was from Mobile, and that's about 3 hours from Selma. You know. Well, well, the sweetheart thing didn't work out. I did get a ringside seat to a slice of American history. Craig Air Force Base, being literally on the highway between Selma and Montgomery. And I was there from 64 to early 1965. I know where the Pettus Bridge is and drove across it many times. And yeah, it was a kind of a dark part of our history, but also in that 13 months that I spent there, I learned to love the South, and I learned to eat grits and catfish and fried okra, and to really appreciate the good people that lived in America's deep South. One experience stands out in my mind. It has absolutely nothing to do with flying, but one day when one of my squadron buddies talked me into going out on a blind date with one of the local girls, and kept saying, "Boy, she's gorgeous. You got to do this thing." So he said, "Oh, okay." So the four of us went to a drive-in movie to see The Great Escape. How many of you are familiar with it? Steve McQueen? Okay, so in the movie there was some German spoken because it was a movie about an escape from a German POW camp. So my buddy, knowing that I spoke a little German, he said, "Ron, what's he saying?" So I translated for the benefit of the people in the car, and my date looked at me and she said, "Are you German?" And I said, "Yeah, pretty much, 100%. My parents both came from the Illinois." And she was quiet for a while, and then finally she looked at me and she says, "I thought you said you was from Illinois." God's truth. So that didn't work out, and I flipped that. Okay. So as the graduation approached and the assignments came down, it was time for us to list our choices of what aircraft we wanted to fly. Now, whether you got your choice or not depended on a number of things, the most important being where you stood in the class. Okay, we had 33 in the class. I finished like comfortably in the middle, 13 out of 33. But it was a matter of where you stood in the class, your instructor's recommendation. If somebody wanted to fly, for example, wanted to fly fighters, and the instructor felt that the student really didn't have the temperament to do that, then they could nix it, which happened very rarely. But ultimately, what governed it was what was available, what the Air Force needed. Well, all I wanted to fly was the F-105 Thunder Chief. This was the biggest, fastest single-engine, single-seat fighter in the world. And every fighter pilot, by the way, wants to fly a single-engine, single-seat airplane. It's just an ego macho thing, okay? So that's what I wanted to fly. Well, when the assignments came down, guess what? My class didn't get a single F-105 assigned to it. But you know how they all say things work out for the best? It's probably just as well, because over 350 F-105s were shot down or lost over Southeast Asia. So again, there must have been a bigger plan in store for me. But 1965 was a year when the Air Force was really ramping up the production of the F-4. This was the newest fighter in the Air Force inventory. And unlike the Navy version, the Air Force had pilots in both cockpits. They had an aircraft commander in the front, and they had a guy in the back that had access to flight control, so you could fly the airplane from the back. So all of a sudden, almost overnight, a whole bunch of backseat F-4 assignments opened up, and I got the first of those backseat assignments. Now, that really amounts to kind of like a co-pilot position, but it was still a fighter, and it was the best I could do, so I said, okay, heck yeah, I'll go. And after all, Tucson, Arizona in February is not a bad place to be. Okay, so after 5 months of training in the F-4, I got assigned to my first operational squadron, which was the 25th Tactical Fighter Squadron at Eglin Air Force Base in Fort Walton Beach, Florida. Tucson, Arizona, Fort Walton Beach, Florida, Destin. I think they were trying to make up for Selma, so it was really a nice area of the country to be. Well, in those 3 years that I spent in Florida, a lot of people cycled in and out of the squadron. Some guys volunteered to go over to Southeast Asia early to do a combat tour, and they got replaced by others coming in from the training units in Tucson. Well, I knew that couple of things. I knew that that my squadron was going to be designated to go as a squadron to Southeast Asia eventually, and I wanted to stick with that squadron. But most of all, I wanted to hang around and upgrade to the front seat, and that's exactly what happened. After just 6 months, I upgraded from the back seat to become an aircraft commander, and that was great. About that time, I got assigned a new backseater, a great guy, First Lieutenant Rich Parks from Park Falls, Wisconsin, and he became my backseater, and the two of us became a pretty good crew. The Air Force was really stressing the crew concept, which on a fighter airplane is kind of hard to do because pilots are used to being pretty independent, and flying as a crew like a bomber or a cargo type was a little bit hard to get used to, but we made it work, and Rich was a great guy. The main responsibility, by the way, of the backseat pilot in an F-4, the primary responsibility is to operate the radar. All the radar controls are in the back. The guy in the front just has a radar scope. And then also you had at that time, some pretty sophisticated navigation, inertial navigation system, and that was also run from the back seat. But the most important thing of a backseater is that second set of eyeballs. Especially is especially important in an air-to-air type engagement. So again, the pilots that were in the back seat didn't relish the idea of being there until later. They were replaced by navigators, and that worked out great because the navigators could fly in a fighter airplane. They weren't pilots, and so they were happy, and as pilots got to upgrade to the front, they were happy. So it all worked out in the end. Now, the last thing that happened to me at Eglin, toward the end of my 3 years there, is I did finally meet the girl of my dreams. Unfortunately, we met only 6 weeks before the squadron left for Southeast Asia. So I'll tell you a little bit more about that because that one did work out. All right. So, as most of you might remember, the world at that time was pretty much divided between communism on the rise throughout the former European colonies and the Western powers. And the U.S. adapted the stance that anybody that was anything we could do to prevent further communist expansion, just ask us. We'll pay any price. And all, you're familiar with that speech. And that's exactly what happened when South Vietnam asked for our help. And trying to counter the insurgency that was happening in South Vietnam. One of the biggest challenges, given both the geography and the political alignments, let me see if that works. One of the biggest challenges, of course, was the fact that between, just alongside Vietnam, you had Laos, which was politically a neutral country, but it was neutral in name only. And the North Vietnamese used this as the main conduit to funnel all their troops and supplies from North Vietnam to feed the insurgency in the South. And what it is you see it was really a whole network of roads and trails that came from the strategic passes between North Vietnam and Laos, all the way down through Laos into South Vietnam. And we did not have any boots on the ground, as they say today. We didn't put troops on the ground in Laos because we did respect that aspect of Laos's neutrality. However, how do you stop them from coming down there? And so the idea was conceived that we would try to erect some kind of an electronic barrier to be able to detect road traffic coming down the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And this was a system that was conceived by Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara at that time through the help of the MITRE Corporation, one of the corporations involved in high technology for military reasons. And they developed a system that ultimately went by the name of Igloo White. Igloo White was the code name for a very elaborate system of electronic sensors that would be implanted all along the roads along the Ho Chi Minh Trail to detect road traffic, troops, supplies coming down the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and once detected, trying to estimate where it would be at some future point in time, and then strike it with a conventional mission. That was the idea behind Igloo White. Now my squadron, while still at Eglin, back in late 1967, was given the mission of taking this Igloo White concept and taking it to Southeast Asia. So we were going to be the lead squadron to test this new system. And to do that and to facilitate the accurate implanting of these sensors, we were supposed to be equipped with a very, very fancy new navigation system called LORAN-D. It was supposed to be very, very accurate. They never got that system to work, and ultimately they never installed it in the airplane, and finally the Air Force just threw up their hands and said, well, you guys are just going to have to use the old Mark I eyeball and forget about the fancy nav system and put those sensors in just through eyeballing it, through map study and eyeballing it. So at the end of May 1968, the whole squadron, 24 aircraft, took off and deployed to Southeast Asia by way of Hawaii, Guam, and ultimately to our new home at Yuban Royal Thai Air Base. And Yuban sits, where are we? Yuban sits right here. And there were 4 other bases. I think Tom Burden talked about how he was at Udorn, which is a little further up north here. Nakhon Phanom I'll talk about, or I'll mention later, because that figures in to some of the things that we did over there. Well, a little bit more detail about this Igloo White mission. These are the various, sorry about that. These are the various sensors that were used, that we implanted along roads and trails and over jungle canopy. We had 2 types of electronic sensors that we would hang on our airplanes on pylons, or we would carry in a dispenser. There was what this was called was an ADSID, an air-delivered seismic intrusion device, which is a fancy name for saying this was a sensor that when it hit the ground, it would bury itself up to the hilt and expose only the top portion of it, which takes a little imagination, but it was a flexible plastic antenna that was supposed to look like a shrub. And we would drop these very close along a road, just a few meters to the side of a road, in a string of 6 of these sensors at a time. Or we would put them in place near a river ford, any place where we felt that there was a lot of concentrated traffic. The other type of sensor was, we called it an accubuoy, which just stands for an acoustic buoy. It was nothing but a microphone that was suspended under a parachute. And we would drop those over that portion of the Ho Chi Minh Trail that was covered with a lot of forest canopy. And we would punch 4 of these sensors out of in fact, let me go back here. We'd punch 4 of those acoustic sensors out of this big dispenser. It looks like a huge bomb, but that's actually a dispenser, and it would carry 4 of these acoustic sensors inside. And they were, to describe them further, it would be about the size of a large mailing tube. Okay, and again, when they would deploy out of that sensor, they would deploy a parachute, and that parachute would hang up in the tree, and it would literally dangle a microphone, so you could hear truck engines, you could hear human voices, things like that. Now, these sensors, once they were implanted in the ground or hanging from a tree, would just wait until the enemy would come down the trail or drive down the road. And then they would put out a signal. And this signal would be captured by an overhead airplane, a huge 4-engine Constellation that would be orbiting about 15,000 feet over Laos, well out of small arms range. And this aircraft then would pick up these signals, amplify them, and download them to Nakhon Phanom, that base in northeast Thailand that I told you about. In fact, let me go back there. So these signals would go to a building, a very secret building that was literally carved out of the jungle called Task Force Alpha. Now this building was full of computers, guys with white lab coats and intelligence officers that would receive all this data coming from the different strings of sensors that we had implanted. And then they would take that data and create information out of there and intelligence, so you could predict where the enemy was going, how long it was going to take them, and they would predict where they would be at some point in the future. Then they would send that information. This all sounds like it's going to take forever, but it all happens very quickly, all electronically. Then they would pass that information on to 7th Air Force headquarters in Saigon, and they would determine then how to best intercept or interdict that road traffic or those troops. And they would assign it to one of the bases and one of the squadrons, and then they would go out and hit it. It could be a B-52 strike coming from Guam. It could be my squadron or a sister squadron flying conventional, dropping conventional bombs to go after the very targets that we found through these electronic sensors. A very, very elaborate system. Did it work? We convinced ourselves that it worked. We did destroy a lot of more trucks and things like that, but they still managed to get through thousands of tons of supplies and equipment. So there was a lot of energy and expense devoted to this squadron. Now, as mentioned, we not only did that for our primary mission, but every time we flew, we were also armed with conventional weaponry. And you see some of it hanging from my airplane here. These are just 500-pound general purpose bombs. And every mission that we would fly had not only the sensors, but we were armed with rockets, conventional bombs like you see here, cluster bombs, things like that, so that we could be used once we got the sensors in. Then we were like hired guns, if you will. In other words, we would be used wherever we were needed to drop our bombs and hit conventional type targets with that kind of weaponry. As far as planning for the missions and the mission prep, typically the order would come in the day before. I think Tom may have mentioned about the frag order, just a portion of the overall air order. And we would break out our part of it, and it would have all the targets that we were supposed to either put sensors on or strike conventionally, and it would give us the time on target and all that sort of stuff. So we would get that information and designate who was going to go where, and we get the schedule posted for the following day. Then early the next morning, we would meet at the Tactical Operations Center, and there'd be a mass briefing, just like you see in the movies. Somebody be up there talking about the weather, talking about where the main threat areas were, the latest bits of intelligence, and so on and so forth. They always briefed where the safe areas were in case we had to bail out. Now, safe areas doesn't sound like the word is safe. It's an acronym. Of course, everything's an acronym. It means that was an area selected for escape and evasion. Basically, it was an area where they thought we had the best chance of maybe being picked up by air rescue. I think Tom talked about that in his first presentation. So anyway, we would get all that in the mass briefing, and then we would break up and go back to the squadrons, and then came time for each individual flight to brief the mission that we were supposed to fly that day. And if you were on a sensor mission, then the flight lead would especially take some extra time in map study, because getting these sensors to exactly where they wanted them was very, very important. So it took a lot of time being very, very accurate in our navigation and in our map study. Once we had briefed our flight, then it was time to go to the PE or personal equipment shop and get suited up for the mission of the day. And that's where we would put on our G suits, or our anti-G suits, our survival vests with our all-important survival radios, things like that. And yes, we'd strap on a Smith & Wesson .38 revolver with a bandolier of bullets. And I often thought, what in the world would I ever do with that thing? I could just see myself trying to hold off a battalion of North Vietnamese soldiers, whose target I just struck, hold them off with a .38 pistol. I don't think so, but we were all armed with those 38s, and then some other things that we would take with us before we stepped out to fly. We'd stuff our pockets with 3 or 4 baby bottles full of water. Everybody that had ever ejected from an airplane would talk about how tremendously thirsty and parched they were waiting for rescue. Just part, I guess, of the shock of the ejection and things like that. So now we had our target study, got all suited up. Then the last thing you do is get your helmet and check out your oxygen mask, make sure all that worked. And then we go out and climb into the crew van and drive out to our airplanes that were parked in revetments. And the airplanes would be all fueled up, armed up, ready to go. And then at the exact moment, we would crank our engines and taxi out for takeoff. After that, it was we'd get airborne and climb up to altitude. And typically, we went on a 2-ship flight, meaning 2 airplanes together. Every once in a while, you'd see we'd fly as a 4-ship. So here, for example, you see a flight of 4. And the first thing you did about 20 minutes after takeoff was to rendezvous with a KC-135 tanker. Because even after 20 minutes, you've already gone through about 3,000 pounds of jet fuel. So we wanted to always top off and go into the target area with a full load of fuel. So that was usually the first thing we did, was to rendezvous with a tanker, and then everybody would cycle onto the tanker. You'd be on there about 10, 12 minutes to get your fuel, and then we usually did that, by the way, in total radio silence. Everything was so routine by that point. So when the last guy got his fuel, then again, off we would go and fly toward the target area. And on the way there, we would contact an airborne command post. And the airborne command post would have sort of a last-minute confirmation of our target, given the call sign of the forward air controller, the guy in the little spotter planes. He'd give us he'd confirm the fax call sign, radio frequencies, things like that. And then we would go on into our designated target area. As we would approach the target area, we'd contact the forward air controller. Again, this is a guy, usually a young lieutenant or captain, to be flying around in a little single engine or twin engine spotter plane. And he'd be responsible for checking everything out within a certain geographic area. So he was familiar with everything in that area. And we would make radio contact with him as we were heading toward him. And then we would start letting down from our altitude once we had a tally-ho or once we spotted him visually. Once we had visual contact, we had confirmation again of the target, then he'd say, okay, I'm going to mark the target. And he would roll in and fire a white phosphorus smoke rocket. And you could see that plume of white smoke from miles away. And if he was right on where he wanted the first sensor to hit, or if it was right on the target, if it was a conventional target, then he'd say, hit my smoke. And then he'd get out of the way, and we would come down. We'd take our spacing, arm up our bombs or our sensors, and down we would go. If it was a sensor delivery, the lead aircraft, or the one that's going to drop the sensors, would descend down to delivery altitude, which we're talking here about 100 feet at 450 knots. Translated, that's about 525 miles an hour. And that's a real hoorah flight. That's when flying is really thrilling, is when you get down low and fast. And but again, the emphasis was on accuracy. And as he approached the release point, he'd hit the what we call the pickle button, which is literally the bomb button, and the first sensor would start coming off the airplane. Now, in that time that those sensors are coming off the airplane or out that dispenser, you have to maintain straight and level flight. And of course, that's always an invitation. If there are any gunners on the ground, that's when they tend to open up on you. So the number 2 guy would take spacing above and behind and sort of like a shotgun position, and just call out enemy fire if he saw it, things like that. But that several seconds while those sensors came off seemed like an hour and a half if you were if you were the one doing that. But we would come off of that target, like I said, and then that part of the mission, the Igloo White portion, would be done. and then we would come off the target and offer our services for whatever other ordnance that we had on board. Again, conventional strike against either a ammunition storage area or a suspected truck park, whatever the FAC or the command post had in mind for us to do.
I have a question.
Sure.
Can you explain again about refueling? You said you were only in the air 20 minutes and you had to refuel? Is that what I understood?
Yeah.
Well then, so once you refueled, how far did you have to go?
Oh, we had a total of about 16,000 pounds of fuel.
And how far can you go on that?
Oh, before you had to refuel again or get on the ground, an hour and a half.
But you still refueled after 20 minutes?
Yeah, because I don't know if you remember from back in the 70s when they had the the fuel embargo. Remember that? You didn't wait till your tank got empty, right? You stopped at every gas station and topped off. And it was kind of that same idea. You just wanted to get into the target area with as much fuel as possible.
And then how, you see this on movies, how difficult is that to refuel when you're in the air like that? I mean, it looks really...
Yeah, I mean, what does somebody say? Playing the violin's easy if you know how, So we're obviously practiced for that, and it's not quite as dangerous as it looks. Sometimes at night it's pretty dicey. At night in bad weather, that's when it can get pretty dicey. But daytime air-to-air refueling really is quite a routine thing, because that fuel probe is actually a big flexible tube, and that boom operator can move that thing. It has some flexibility to move side by side and up and down.
And how close are you to the two planes?
Well, you can see pretty close. So in other words, if you're really ham-fisted, you could have a mid-air collision. But again, we're pretty trained to do that. So it looks more dangerous than it is. Again, in daytime, good weather, it's...
What would be your speed at that time?
As I recall, 320 knots indicated, so about 400 and some miles an hour. But then you're both at the same speed, and yeah. And if things get really bad, he can say breakaway, and he can pull that probe out very quickly, and then you pull the throttle back and go off. So
all this dangerous bombing, but that fascinates me.
yeah, but it's like I said, when the weather's good, it breaks up the monotony. A couple of times that I flew a fighter across the Pacific or the Atlantic, which is a very, very long flight. Thank goodness for air refueling, because it breaks up the monotony. And yes.
If you had to, let's say you were in a situation where you had to jump out of the plane, did you use a parachute or did you use ejector seats?
Well, the ejection seat gets you out of the airplane. Okay? Once you're out of the airplane, you're still connected to the seat and everything.
Yeah.
Until you hit a certain altitude, and then everything's automatic. It all opens up, the seat falls away, the parachute opens up, and you come down in your parachute. If it works.
I didn't know if it worked.
It almost always does.
One or the other.
No. Ejecting is just meaning that's how you get out of the airplane. It blows you out on a rocket-powered seat. And okay. So, just a few things about night flying. Same as day flying, except you can't see very well. Actually, again, if the weather's good, you can see quite well once your eyes get accustomed to the dark. So usually the first thing we do when we get in our cockpit is we take some masking tape with us, and you tape over all extraneous lights. You don't want any extraneous lights blinking at you to detract from your night vision. And so again, lights that you can't cover up, you cover up about 90% of them, and you try to get the cockpit just as dark as possible. And then once you're airborne, boy, oh boy, you go into the countryside over there, over Thailand or Laos, and it's black. It's I wrote an article that you guys can read at your leisure, and it talks about flying at night. The biggest thing, the biggest worry at night is if the weather's bad, if there's no moon, the possibility of getting spatial disorientation is pretty real. The worst thing you can do is totally believe your senses, because your senses lie to you. You get in a turn if you don't have a horizon to look at, because the eyes override everything. And if you don't have a horizon to look at, those hairs in the middle of your ear tell you that you're turning left or right, and then if you try to correct on that, when in fact you're straight and level, then all you're doing is aggravating the situation. And if you do it bad enough, you can really literally get so disoriented that you can go out of control. So you really have to trust your instruments, and if you're flying in formation, either with another airplane or on the tanker, then that other airplane, your leader, or that tanker plane becomes your horizon. And that just means you got to have a lot of faith that he knows what he's doing. Because again, your senses could tell you you're in a turn when in fact you take a peek at your attitude indicator in the airplane and it tells you, no, you're straight and level. So it just takes some discipline. That's where all your good tax money that trained us to fly in instruments, that's where it gets paid off, is when you get into bad weather. Oh yeah, rules of engagement. I think Tom made some mention about that. A lot of the rules of engagement over there were common sense. I mean, you didn't bomb civilians. You didn't bomb. By the way, in 200 missions, and this is just as an aside, in the 200 missions that I flew in Southeast Asia, I never once saw a human being on the ground. Never once. I saw evidence of humans because I was getting shot at. And one time I saw a guy trying to get away in a truck, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But other than that, I never saw a human being on the ground. Never dropped a bomb on a village or a city. Everything was out along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which is just a trail that goes through the wild countryside of Laos. So it's just kind of an interesting thing.
No water buffaloes like Tom?
Those water buffaloes would sometimes set off, and the Vietnamese knew this. This is why some of those sensor things are really a joke, because the North Vietnamese knew that you could just run a herd of buffalo down the road and it would trigger those sensors, and you'd think a bunch of trucks or bad guys coming, and it was just moo cows, Rules of engagement, some of them were pretty frustrating. If you were attacked by an enemy aircraft, which I never was, but if you were, you could go and engage with that airplane. But you could not bomb the airfield from which he took off. The airfields were off limits.
Why was
It didn't take us long to figure out that this war was being very closely micromanaged by suits in Washington, okay? So some of these rules of engagement, like I said, some of them were common sense. We had no problem with that. But many of the other rules just absolutely were very tough to live with. But you had to, or you're going to get in deep legal trouble. Right before I left for Southeast Asia, for example, President Johnson, as an inducement to get the North Vietnamese to come to the peace talks, said, okay, we'll stop bombing Hanoi and Haiphong. So they stopped the bombing of Hanoi. Well, that didn't do a whole lot. So later on, during the time that I was there, he moved the no-bomb line further south to the point where I could fly up to Mugia Pass, which was the most strategic pass between North Vietnam and Laos. And I could fly up to the pass, but not beyond it. And I still remember one day, up at altitude, I could look down and look north of the Mugia Pass, and it looked like the Pomona Freeway. I mean, there were trucks lined up just waiting for nightfall to get through the pass, to get down the trail and into South Vietnam. And I couldn't do a thing about it. That was the rules of engagement. We could, so again, some of those things were understandable, and others were just kind of frustrating to have to live with. And it wasn't until 1972, when President Nixon took the gloves off and we went after all the targets in Hanoi, Haiphong, but by that time I'd been away from it for 3 years. But so the rules of engagement were a little bit frustrating. Ah, yes. Not everything went well. There were times when things got a little dicey. The picture on the left, which appears to be battle damage, was damage all right, but it wasn't battle damage. It was something I had done to myself. and here's the story. So one day I was assigned to fly up with another aircraft, which happened to be occupied by my squadron commander. And my job that day was to fly and deliver some gravel mines. Now, gravel mines are tiny little bomblets, and we could carry thousands of these little bomblets in a humongous dispenser. That dispenser was about this wide and about 6 feet long, and we could carry 3 of them on a wing station. And inside that canister, like I said, would be stuffed thousands of these little bomblets. And when they would spread out, they were an area denial weapon, is what the fancy word for it. And what they would do was spread these little bomblets all over the road so that any truck that drove over it, it could blow the wheel off the truck, things like that. So my job that particular day was to fly low along the trail and deliver these gravel mines. And these canisters on that day were loaded on my left inboard wing station. And that becomes important here in a minute. And on the right side, I had conventional bombs. So in I went, delivered accomplished the primary mission that day and came off the target. And just as I was coming off the target, I looked down and I see this Gomer in a truck trying to get away. Remember I told you I never saw a human being, but this time I came close. There was an actual enemy truck, and he was trying to hightail it back to North Vietnam. So I said, oh my goodness, I'm going to go get that guy. So I started climbing back up to altitude, and as I'm climbing up, I start throwing switches in the cockpit. And I turn the switch on that I think I'm selecting my bombs on the right station, but in fact, I wasn't looking. I was just keeping my eye on that truck. And I turned the switch on to the left station where those empty canisters were loaded. Now, those empty canisters were not meant to be dropped like a bomb. They were meant to be taken back home when they were empty. Now, if you had to get rid of them, you could, but you were supposed to be straight and level at about 200 miles an hour and all that stuff. So here I am in my dive bomb going after this truck. And I get him in my gun sight. I'm 450 knots at a 45-degree dive angle. And I hit the pickle button, and all of a sudden, wham, wham, wham! And I am, excuse my French, I'm ass over tea kettle. I mean, I'm out. The airplane just goes wacko on me, and I thought, oh my God, Mrs. Schloemer's little boy Ronnie finally got hit. I was convinced I had been nailed by a AAA weapon, And naturally, when I was able to get the airplane going right side up. And poor Rich Parks in the back seat, he didn't know what was going on. And so I waited until I could muster up my best John Wayne voice. The worst thing you want to do is sound like a dork on the radio. That's absolutely the worst thing. So I summoned up my best John Wayne voice, keyed the mic, and said, "Lead, I'm hit. So he says, okay, I'm coming to find you. So he's going to come join up with me. So I find that when I get below 350 knots, the airplane becomes fairly controllable again. And so I'm thinking, maybe we're not going to have to bail out of this airplane. Maybe I can make it back. So I start heading back to Thailand, back to Yuban. And as I'm heading to Yuban, I started taking an assessment of the cockpit. And I look down, and both RPM gauges are whirling away. Hydraulic pressure's good. Oil pressure's good. And I'm thinking, hey, there's nothing wrong with the airplane. About this time, I looked to see where I had set my switches. And all of a sudden, it was like I had been hit right in the gut, because I realized what had happened. That instead of selecting the bombs on the right station, I selected those empty canisters on the left station. And when they came off in that 450 knot dive, boom, they slammed up on the underside of the wing, absolutely shredded the wing tank. That used to be a 370-gallon wing tank, by the way. Damaged the flaps pretty considerably. And so I thought, holy smokes, I did it to myself. So my flight lead joined up with me, and he, kind of looked me over and confirmed what I had done. And he says, we better do a controllability check. In other words, make sure that you can land the airplane. So you do. You get down to a lower altitude, and you slow it down to landing speed. You drop the gear, and we allowed us how it was safe to land, no flap landing. And so that's what I did. I made it back to U-Bahn and landed. And of course, I'm taxiing in, and everybody's looking at me taxiing in, looking like this, and they think, oh, wow, look at him, hero of the day, About that time, I get a call, Banyan 1 or Banyan 2 command post wants to talk to you. Yeah, I figured, But, in peacetime, that would have been a really black mark on my career. And as it turned out, nothing was said. They wrote it off to, the heat of the battle, the confusion of just a switch error, and nothing came of it. So that's one of the, if you will, the benefits of flying in combat.
What about at the O Club that night?
I think I had a headache. I didn't make it over to the club that night. So a quick story on this other one about tally-ho, by the way, is pilot language for I see it, If I see something, tally-ho, like tally-ho the fox. So I was almost through with my combat tour over there, and I had a brand new guy in the back seat, First Lieutenant Dick Lucky Pierre Drolet. And he was in the back seat, and this was his first or second combat mission, and which they often did. If a new guy came in, they let him fly with a more experienced aircrew member. So Drolet's in the back seat, and we had been on just a conventional strike mission in the southern part of North Vietnam, and we were heading on back to U-Bahn. And we had there was a system in the airplane that you could drop bombs using the radar, and they wanted the back seaters to get some practice using this particular bombing system. So we thought, well, once we're back into Thailand, we'll just pick a target and just make some practice runs, not drop anything, but just make the runs. So I told my flight leader, I said, well, you go on home. I said, what, we can do this by ourselves. So my flight leader went on home and landed at U-Bahn, and we stayed behind and started doing some practice bomb runs. Well, after about 20 minutes, I'm looking at the gas gauge, the fuel gauge, and it's time to go home. What we call bingo fuel. If you're bingo, that means you've got just enough fuel to make it back safely for a landing, okay? So I'm at bingo fuel, so I says, okay, Dick, we got to go home. So I turn the airplane in the general heading of U-Bahn, okay? It's about 6 o'clock in the evening, and it's at a time of year when the haze is so incredible, it's like smog. Anybody here ever been to LA? You know what I'm talking about. So you get all this smog in the air, the sun is setting, and guess what they have in Thailand? Rice paddies. Thousands of rice paddies. And every one of them was like a mirror. What I'm getting at is you couldn't see squat. And I'm thinking, well, shoot, because at first I just pick up a landmark and start heading to U-Bahn. So I said, well, I can't do it visually, so we turn on the primary navigation system is called a TACAN, Tactical Air Navigation. It gives you a bearing and a distance to the station. Well, guess what? The TACAN's not working. So I asked Drolet in the back seat, I says, well, what does the inertial nav tell us? Well, the inertial nav had gotten so skewed from our practice bombing runs that it was unreliable. So now we had no TACAN, no vision. I couldn't see anything, at least not very well forward, and we had no inertial. So I'm thinking, Now, I'm still not totally worried because I can just call approach control, the radar people. That's how we all do it. We just call approach control, and they pick us up on radar, and they tell us to fly a certain heading, and that's it. So the conversation on the radio goes something like, their call sign, by the way, is Lion, all right? And my call sign, I think that day was Banyan. So this is, Lion, Lion, this is Banyan. Banyan, Lion, go ahead. Banyan requesting distance and bearing to home plate, meaning U-Bahn. He said, Roger, Banyan, what's your position? And I'm thinking, geez, if I knew that, you know. I didn't know what my position was other than just general terms. So I said, Banyan's on the 080 radial for 50 miles. I thought, you know, that's somewhere east of the field and seemed about right. What comes back from Lion Control? Negative contact, Banyan. So now the gas gauge, I'm getting this red light that says min fuel. And now my heart starts thumping. Now I'm starting to get scared because I have no nav aids, I can't see squat, and they can't pick me up on radar. I think, oh my God, you know, and you know how they say, well, if you're drowning, you know, your life passes in front of you. Well, if you screw up in an airplane, you know, your career passes in front of you because, you know, you're done for. And, you know, the words of my first squadron commander came echoing back. Many years before that, I had this commander tell me, he came up to me one day and he said, Ron, he said, do you know that the English language has more words than any other language on the planet? And I'm thinking, no, sir, I didn't know that. I'm thinking, where's he going with this? I said, no, sir, I didn't know that. He said, well, he says it does, but I'll tell you what. There's still never enough words to explain how you'd ever run out of fuel in an airplane. So this is what I'm thinking, you know. I think, holy cow. So now I'm, as we say, running out of airspeed and ideas quickly. So about the only thing left to do is we have a transponder, you know, that puts out a particular code and radar code. I could squawk emergency, and that puts out a big blossoming code that everybody sees, but it tells the world that you've got a dire emergency. And I thought, well, if I squawk emergency, somebody will pick me up on radar and give me a vector. So just as I'm about to do that, and in the meantime, by the way, yeah, I'm bargaining with God, you know, all the things I would give up if I get out of this. and something tells me to take one last look, so I roll the airplane inverted. And I look down, and guess what? I am right over the airfield. And of course, Lion Control is, Banyan, say again. And I said, disregard. I says, I'm going to tower frequency. And man, I plummeted like a stone, you know, and got into the traffic pattern and put it on the ground. And when I shut down that day, I had approximately 10 minutes of fuel left. So, yeah, that was a lesson learned. Of course, on the way to the bar, I swore Drolet to secrecy. So, speaking of the bar, what did we do when we were done flying? Well, my quarters was within crawling distance of the officers' club. And that was just right across the parking lot. And all social life revolved around the O Club. That's where we partied. That's where we had our adult beverages. That's where we took our meals. We had a dining room there. And you'd go in there and you'd circle on the menu in English what you wanted to be served, and then these Thai girls would come back with it because they couldn't read English, but it worked out. And that's where we partied, and we didn't need a whole lot of excuses to have a party. Somebody finished his combat tour, we had a party. If somebody got shot down and rescued, we'd have a party, with or without him, you know. And we'd do some crazy things, and as you can see from what I'm holding in my hand, those are the days before the de-glamorization of alcohol, so we all drank freely, and yes, we all smoked, which was the dumbest thing. But we had a good time, and some of the other things we did is we had our own little, we made music a lot, but now some of the songs that we sang, it couldn't be repeated in mixed company, but again, we had a great time. As far as other things about this, you might find this of mild interest anyway. That was our hooch, our quarters. Doesn't look like the Ritz-Carlton, but it was quite adequate. It was air conditioned, and trust me, in Thailand you needed air conditioning, or at least pilots did. You know, we were pampered, right, Tom? So we had air conditioned quarters. There were 2 guys to a room, but there was a room divider in there, so it was kind of like we had a semi-private room. Each of the hooches there had a day room where we had a dart board and things like that. Sit around, play cards, throw darts, tell lies. What else? Oh yeah, each hooch was assigned a houseboy that would take care of, shining your boots, taking your laundry. It was not bad living at all. We had plenty of opportunity to go into town. Yuban was in a free country, if you will. It was a kingdom, but there was freedom to drive around. Some of us even had bought motorcycles while we were over there, and we'd go out touring out in the countryside. And we could go downtown just about any time we wanted to for a baht, which was equivalent to a nickel. So naturally we call it taking the baht bus uptown. And there were lots of things to do uptown, but we mostly stayed away from those places. So we'd go and find different, sometimes the biggest problem after we came back from a mission was, where are we going to eat tonight? And pick out a new restaurant. As far as communicating back home, remember that sweetheart that I met right before I left? Well, luckily she was a letter writer, and actually I was too. When I passed through the Philippines, I bought a Smith Corona electric typewriter, and we wrote each other every day, just about every day. But this was all in the days before Skype, before any of that. So you'd write a letter and put it in the mailbox. She wouldn't get it for 5 days. Then if she sat down right away to write back, I'd get it 5 days later. So you had some time to pass, and that made interesting commentary sometimes. But one of these days when our daughters go through our basement and Lynn and I are pushing up daisies, they're going to come across a box that's got something like 400 letters in there. That's kind of sweet. We also had an opportunity to go to Bangkok. That was fairly easy. We could just jump on a plane that came through all the time, and if you wanted to, we could go down to Bangkok, which of course is the capital of Thailand. It had beautiful hotels and things like that. So restaurants. It was really great. One of the other things too, and depends on those of us that were stationed in Thailand, it was just like being stationed in Europe. We could take leave just as if we were back in the States. Whereas if you were stationed in Vietnam, you couldn't do that, So halfway through my tour, I was able to take 2 weeks of leave. And naturally, I flew on home and picked up my sweetheart, and we drove from Fort Walton Beach to Mississippi, and where I got to meet her parents, and then on up to Illinois for her to meet my parents. And once we got the approval of both sets of parents, we became officially engaged halfway through the tour. So then we drove back to Florida. So that was tough to have to come back to finish the second half of that tour. Another thing that all of us enjoyed over there is we not only could take leave, we could travel around to Bangkok. I got to Chiang Mai on a religious retreat. Chiang Mai is the summer capital for the king and queen. It's the summer palaces up there. It's a beautiful tourist area. So Thailand was really a neat place to live. And we also got R&R, rest and recreation. And I could have gone anywhere from Kuala Lumpur to Hong Kong to Hawaii to Sydney, Australia. Naturally, I wanted to go to Honolulu, and I was willing to pay my fiance's way to Honolulu, and she reminded me very quickly that we weren't married yet, and forget it. It was a different time. It was a different time. So I said, well, all right. So my second choice, but it turned out to be a good one, was to figure I'd never have a chance to go to Australia again. So I took a 2 week or a week to go to Sydney, and that was pretty cool. Well, By the beginning of April of 1969, most of us that had been over there, at least from the beginning, had somewhere around 150 missions. So I thought, hey, why not shoot for 200? It's a nice round number. So that's what I tried to do, and that's what I did. And this is just a picture of an F-4 coming in. So after 200 missions, touchdown. And let me tell you that I'd be lying if I said that wasn't an exhilarating feeling to know that you made it through, and you're coming back crossing that Mekong River for what may be the last time, and touchdown at Ubon. And when you finish your tour, there's always a little tradition, a ceremony. Usually the first thing you do when you taxi back to the revetments is somebody comes out of nowhere and throws a bucket of water on you and douses you, and comes up and pulls your Mae West life preservers. A beautiful Thai girl comes out and throws a lei around your neck, and then somebody hands you a bottle of champagne, which is typically consumed on the spot, and then you head off to a very quick debriefing with intelligence, and then on to the officers' club. And then after that, it's just, a couple of days of out processing, getting that last bit of tailor-made clothes made, and some administrative work, and then getting on an airplane to fly to Bangkok, and from there, getting on the Freedom Bird to fly back to the States. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is that 50 years ago. So I guess we still have a few minutes if anybody has any. The articles that we handed out, one of them I just happened to come across. The life is a box of sea rations. I wish I had written that. I didn't. I can't take credit for it. But it, to me, is one of the best explanations of kind of what goes through a person's mind that is serving in combat, and it's very, very well written. The other is an article that I wrote that was first published in, 1998 or something like that in the Journal News. And then it was picked up later and it was published in a professional publication called Today is Christmas. And it's just, again, just one of those recollections of one day in Southeast Asia during my tour. So I'd be happy to answer any other questions.
The guy in the truck that was trying to get away that you were trying to go after?
The
guy in the truck?
Yeah.
He got away, I think.
I like to think that I got him, but I didn't, because the bombs didn't come off; those canisters did. Yeah, so yeah. The only person that I think that I may have hurt over there that I had evidence of is one day they let us go to visit this Task Force Alpha. Remember I told you about this building with all the computers and all that stuff? And when we were up there visiting, they knew that we were the squadron that was delivering this stuff. And he says, one of the officials there, one of the intel officers, said, "Hey, you got to come listen to this." And they played a recording, and I think that it was one of the acoustic sensors that I had delivered. And it was a recording, and it was clear without even being able to speak Vietnamese. You knew what was happening. They had spotted this thing hanging in a tree. And you could almost hear this guy grunting and groaning, climbing up the tree to retrieve that thing, and then you heard, "Ah!" as he fell out of the tree. So, I didn't claim him, but I like to think that maybe I had a hand in that.
There's an article in today's Journal News about the military being short of pilots, and it mentioned it takes 5 years to train one. It looks like you were maybe 3 years in your flight training. Is that what I saw?
Undergraduate pilot training in my day is 13 months, and then advanced training to learn to fly a fighter type aircraft is about another 5-6 months. So in my time, it was just short of 2 years before you're considered really combat ready.
So that reflects the change in complexity of
Yeah.
navigating our today's plane?
Yeah, everybody thinks that because airplanes are so loaded with technology that flying is easier. It really isn't. It's more challenging because there's now the pilot has to process so much more information that he gets from all this technology. And boy, I'll tell you, that's why they need young people that are adept at playing computer games, and I wouldn't be suited for that. But yeah, to get somebody up to where they're really no kidding combat ready takes a long time. And because of that, and because of the tremendous investment of tax dollars to train somebody, they demand a fairly lengthy commitment. And you know how young people are. The C word is one they don't really like, you know. And to tell them you're going to have a 10-year commitment if you want to be a fighter pilot, you know, and they look and see the airlines are begging for pilots as well, and they see the kinds of constant deployments that the military has to fly, and they say, gee, it's not for me. And so, yeah, the Air Force is, and I'm not the guy to talk to about that, but there is a very critical shortage of pilots simply because they don't have enough that want to commit to that length of time. Yeah. Oh, yeah. If for those of you that that go up to the National Museum of the Air Force up in Dayton, there is a display of these sensors up there, so you can actually go up and see them for real. But that's a good picture of the different types of sensors. And like I say, it was a lot of money and energy and brain power was invested in making that system work, but I don't think it was all that successful, obviously, since it didn't really stop the flow of traffic. So it stopped it some, but it was just too little too late. Well, again, thank you very much.
Thanks, Ron.
Sure.
Next week, Carl Becker will be talking about his experiences just north of Saigon in the jungles of South Vietnam.